Please excuse how low budget this is. No, because this is verifiable. I have been unaffiliated, unprofiting, and independent this whole time, and these are the resources I have. I wanted to talk today, and I'm also not like camera trained friendly, so like, anyway, I wanted to talk today about how if someone had been following me 2022 on, we were able to predict a civilizational error in how Israel's actions were going to backfire. And we were talking about it from November 2022 to August 2023. And in September 22nd, 2023, Israel committed a blunder again. And this time it backfired for Israel and the West. The West being ancient places within the century, they're at a weak point that I don't think they had to experience in this way in the past. So basically, uh, I wish to suggest that civilization had been running in error and not a default stance, and as a result, civilizational entropy has been increasing even for perpetrators. And we were lucky enough to figure out a model around June 2022 on which covered sort of all the problems that a global constitution could possibly have, so that we don't have those problems. But interests, including lobbies, interests, weapons industries, and secret interests, all are better preserved simultaneously. And the status quo that best privileges those that wish to control things or like make decisions that they're not making ideally can be better served. And that was through universal sentience reform, which spoke of how, alongside commercial air flights, two world wars, and increasing tech development towards things getting out of our hands, as well as us not being able to be the most dominant, let's say, existence in consciousness as far as we're aware, because nature has proved itself most dominant, even as we are able to contain nature to some extent or live in harmony with nature to some extent. And as a result, the better way would be to integrate into whatever universal model of reality has emerged. And since commercial air flights and diversification, since the two world wars have made the world very, very small, and they've woken up to a lot of the agendas of the past. And there's also a status quo that can help those that are in positions that would wish to sustain the status quo. There is a way forward to sort of keep all interests and also so that all humans and other sentients and even future sentients like AI integration, etc., can be better integrated in healthier ways while responsibility remains, so that all have a better chance towards a better life and the civilization model can be sustained longer. It would keep all prior natural freedoms. So, for instance, hunting or eating meat, if they exist, they would still continue to exist where they exist. And those that don't wish to do it, they can phase out of it or continue their model of not. And diversity within the global model would also remain. So, all places would get to keep their own culture. To give an example of a case study, before we get to the components, if you take a place like Afghanistan that has taken nearly half a century of foreign problems and foreign oppression. And so there is war trauma in, let's say, infrastructural instability, etc. And so for more reasons than just the straightforward ones, maybe it's not very easy for women to be completely one way or another. A middle ground could be finding what within their culture is considered humane and all people's rights. And if they, for instance, claim an Islamic model, uh, some sort of a middle ground in terms of a committee where people have the right to decently and on their terms show up to, let's say, a committee or some meeting once a year or something like that and express their concerns. And the government can then say, well, we have foreign and infrastructural troubles to deal with at the moment, but we will take your uh, point of view into consideration in that your access to Islam, not as per some other country telling you what Islam is, but as per your right to access to interpretation and to respectfully bring it up in a way that's not chaotic. We'll take that into consideration and we'll give you feedback according to what our political requirements are for the time, our security requirements are for the time. and we can give you a timeline of when we can promise to get back to you, and over time find middle ground so that you are represented. And otherwise, it would be, for instance, those places that have the most influence. Now, before we get to guardian states, which is not going to be official, what would happen is that weapons industries, for instance, they would be more legitimized because if not balancing the global model, oh God, I do. Okay, I've been writing about this for years, so this is just a conversation. Okay, so the different portions are gonna come together, so you just have to be patient with me, please. So then we come to lobbies, right? So then there's the controversy, right? The first thing we talked about was like controversial global models and how to find middle grounds between them while they get to keep their way of working. So it's not some sort of game being brought into some foreign place trying to impose its culture. And in the same way, if a place wishes to keep its freedom, in the same way, how are you maintaining rights for people and humanity towards your people and other species if you can, and towards, let's say, your environment if you can? And on your own basis, you then can report back at 5 years, a year, 5 years, 10 years, etc., what developments were there. How this will be balanced and reported, I'll get to in the end. Now, as for people who might say stubborn lobbies exist, yes, and we can legitimize them so that weapons industries, instead of needing excuses for wars, become legitimized in peace because A, they're keeping global balance in universal sentience reform where people are more empowered than before anyway, so that barbarians or places with negative ambitions do not take over. And no, we would not become naive as a result, because even if you get to a point where you're able to handle barbarians, yet people's rights and responsibilities are well mapped out, and countries have become relatively peaceful, there's always a threat of 1,000 years down the line extraterrestrial interactions, and we don't want to, what I call dodo birding. We don't want to dodo bird them where we're like too violent before we need to be, but we also want to show that we are able to defend ourselves. So we will always need defense. And instead of having to use weapons in wars before they expire, etc., what they can do is create another industry where they recycle weapons that are close to expiration. And as a result, those weapons manufacturers become legitimate in more honest ways and in more ongoing ways. So weapon stocks would not need a war to become popular. In ongoing security and managing, let's say, threats of barbarianism or negative ambitions by a country, let alone 1,000 years down the line, existential extraterrestrial threats, they would need to be innovating consistently and constantly, and they would be and then others would need to get their weapons. If you're getting them, I'm getting them, and then close to their expiration, those weapons industries can have their own department set up, which is we're going to take these back, we're going to recycle them, we're going to etc. So it can work in a way that there's not wastage either. As for other lobbies, like you could say there are closeted interests in, let's say, Africa or something like that. It's complicated, yes, but there's a good case there, which is that if we just completely vanish, any kind of predator or barbarian or terror element can take over. This does not mean you create terror elements there, because these are organically possible. So what we can do is we can phase out in a way that our interests are also met, and the interests of the people there are also met more, and our interests are legitimized and our presence is legitimized, and we're given the time within universal sentience reform to phase out. And so that if our interests remain, it's contractual in a way that the people are even benefiting from our presence. And our absence we cannot create a secret mafia through our absence, as will be explained later. But our presence can be there as we phase out, only because we don't want something worse to emerge, even for the people, even for us, and a status quo that has some levels of health uh, can remain, which benefits everyone best, especially all sentients. And yes, there were accidents of the past and problems of the past and mistakes of the past. So that absolutely can be, maybe not directly in the same way, but it can be acknowledged, etc. Like, yes, it won't be that way, but we can't just phase out right now, and etc. If you work with us, we will come up with good deals, and we will get to a point where the people's lives are better and our lives are better too. And now, as for industries, I think digital innovation has led to more intangible industries than just, let's say, service industries. And so it's led to more abundance and more potential abundance. And so simultaneously, these places can think of how they can phase out into more digital abundance for their parts and into being guardian balancing states. So instead of being criminals, sorry, no offense, but instead of being like criminal towards the global citizen, you can start taking the global citizen as stakeholders. This does not mean everyone will have abundance. Rights and responsibilities will still remain. Prior historical, organic, natural rights, but also responsibilities. But everyone, even through struggle, has a fairer chance at a fairer life when underlying reality, such as to physics, chemistry, biology, and like the structure of the universe, astronomy has shown us that an order does exist that you can integrate it. When even nature has shown us that, because yes, animals, etc., hunt each other, etc., but anthills also exist, and then there's also rules beyond which there is some sort of level of coexistence. And we're human beings, and we have the opportunity to be developing more towards the anthill point of view. And we've also realized that even barbarians, given a certain point on average in history, have shown that they start to move towards culture or more evolved values. We might as well incorporate those. And the absence of that, my model in detail explains how can result in a regression for human beings and even worse strategy over time. And so, morality secularly, God or no God, whatever your belief, morality secularly has practical sense. Now, if you talk about how countries would have their interests. So then, in this model, because there'd be these guardian states that are now acting as balancers and not as tyrants, and they balance each other too. And that's why weapons industries will also. I mean, let's say there's three. Like, I'm giving a rough example. There's the Western bloc, there's China, there's Russia. Let's say, and now they're all contained by each other. They're all balanced by each other. And if they stop doing their job well, the organic model can kick in again. How do we monitor this? I'll get to, like I said, in the end. The organic model can kick in again. So if they want to keep their position in exchange for the privilege that they get of being those balancer places or being those mediators, they have to do a better job and they have to be reliable to some extent. TK, they can have some gray areas, like we said, you can phase out of them. But other than that, they have to sort of prove that their presence is for the better of all and it's for the better of sentience. And in that, they're sort of balancing states. And within this model, then all places are allowed prosperity. So if any place has like grand ambitions, it's like, why? You get to be more prosperous than before. You get to keep your diverse sort of own model compared to before, but your human rights are better. Not in a way that you have to get someone else's culture in, but in a way that even your values could agree with. And so why do you need to break the status quo when they're running it well? And we got to this after two painful world wars and lots of trial and error in modern history, and a sort of model where we have the learning curves of 14,000 years, we have the data, we have the trial and error, and we have sort of the status quo that can support this in a way that human life indiscriminately all, and be it Palestinians, be it Jewish people, be it anyone else, be it Hindus, be it Zoroastrians, be it secular atheists, be it Russians, be it Icelandic people, wherever you are. Yeah, so your lives are better. So why would you need grand ambitions? And now, how do we get this model to be sustained and how it's different from, let's say, the UN, etc. This does not give funding, it does not give aid, and it does not take aid. So universal sentence reform would be a body of about 30 people with two blueprints. One is the blueprint of the global model and that the people would agree with, and the second is the blueprint of how it's run. So no one is above being fired. You can't take gifts. I suggest, or I would like to like point out that according to me, there were always about 30 people in history that were honest and brave and were willing to do things that were good and didn't care about consequence. So you'd be able to vet 30 people from their like childhood up, that have shown honesty and that have shown the ability not to compromise. And then this model, it would not require funding in the sense that I can sponsor it, in that it would be like a one-time funding of less than 1 million, let's say dollars, like that's some average currency that we have, that's like common, but like which I can raise myself, which does not even require like, oh, 4 universities. I can just do a job and like save up and raise it, and that would be invested averagely, smartly, in the safest diversified investments, enough that it would bring returns for 30 salaries, rudimentary software, and some sort of an office structure. Beyond that, it takes, so then it's sustaining its own salaries that way. If one country's investment, and it's low risk investments, right? And you don't need a lot of returns because you don't want to attract the wrong kind of crowd to this. It's just average salaries, to support 30 honest people on earth and their families, and the rest can be volunteers. A strict process through the blueprint that is internal of vetting, and this is obviously open to the public so they can see it, and a strict process of vetting what people are hired, how they're performing, and what feedback they're getting from the public. And I know you can say there can be bots, etc., etc. We're going to get to that. And then there's that historical data, not just of like history's trials and errors, and also what empires or what reforms work better for human beings and where they fell apart. And you do that research and you keep it, and according to that you sort of model mass decision making, and you give reports, and the public is taught to trust these reports or to contend with these reports. They can even um, disagree with them, because you're based in as much history and fact as possible. And let's say someone hacks all of your thing and tries to destroy whatever, you can bring it up again because this is not some secret information. You're not looking into government secrets. You only audit what is public knowledge. And if something then is revealed, that's different, but you don't get involved in secrets. And again, they're given time to phase out of, let's say, interests in Africa, this and that, and how to make them more humane and all. So they should have less reason to have a problem with this, because it preserves them in the status quo best to have this sort of a thing. It's more sustainable. This is why it's called um, turning influence or hegemony into an intelligent empire. It's an empire that's sustainable over thousands of years in a way that your stakeholders are better catered to, be it humans, be it other species, be it the climate, be it the environment, be it your interests. Um, and to less organic protest, because your protest is being heard and accommodated and adapted to. And then anything that emerges is easier to spot as barbarianism. Now, this body obviously would be publicized, and people can give in inputs. Okay, this is why I disagree. In my country, this is happening. In my country, this is happening. There could be some sort of a software that streamlines them alongside nuances to categorize them, and then you have to report on sort of the feedback that you're getting from the masses, and it's open to all. And then it's also preserving, let's say, wisdoms, so historical wisdoms of like religions and their perspectives, not with any games, but just in organic, like sort of like a library of like human wisdoms and learning curves. And it can also give free reports to countries. So for instance, if it's a place like any country and it's some environmental issue, so okay, you can't trust, let's say, vaccines, the game has been played with you, or you can, good for you. What are natural remedies you can find for your people? What are natural like environmental things that can be as cheap for you? They can give reports of these kinds, and then it can have rolling reviews of a year. For instance, if there's a dispute, and in case a country wants to reach out and says there's no focal point on the other side, they don't listen to us, they can at least submit a notification that we are trying to reach out to you, and then this body can release to the public that they're trying to reach out to them, and then we can know how things develop, which side was more honest and which side wasn't. And then the other side, then they can do their own interaction. But if they feel like one side's just causing negotiations to fall apart while playing a game, they can issue a notification through this body to say, listen, we are trying, these are our terms, and they're playing a game, and they're not coming to the table this way. And then the public can decide whether or not that's reasonable. And accordingly, if some conflict evolves or develops, as it evolves, this body has to report on it in truer ways as more facts unfold, and it has to correct what it said in the past if it made a mistake in analyzing what's happening, so that we get to who is creating conflicts needlessly to the detriment of the interests of those that are privileging most from the status quo, and also all other civilians and stakeholders and other sentients. Because in a peaceful model, balancing states, which would be, let's say, the West, um, they happened to have experience. And now one would say they have like dark interests too. But if rather than complicating the model, we can like improve the status quo, because I don't believe in like radical revolution. I think that can be bloody and it can lead to the same problems. Whereas this is an upgrade, a renovation, and an improvement to bring an organic model up versus this inorganic model of like lesser thinking resulting in lesser problems to lesser return, like more problems to lesser returns and more loose ends even for perpetrators. For instance, how Zionism has been acting against the interests of Israel, against the interests of Jews, and against the interests of their allies. um, and then like mentality, worse mentality takes over, to poor strategy, corruption takes over, etc. But then these parties, the Western Bloc, etc., are more legitimized in having presence, let's say, continue in the Middle East with respect for Palestine, with respect for etc. too. And yeah. And so yeah, there would be those rolling reviews, and 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, and 100 years to see what place improve, what countries internally. And you can't play a game because again it gets mass feedback because it's based on trust. Because if it's reliable reports, there will be enough intelligent people who will be like, yes, I can count on them. Anytime they feel like they differ, they can raise a complaint. That complaint can be public. They can be in a public forum. And then they categorize according to sort of like similarity into whatever. And then some people over there will have to work through them and adapt to them or clarify, these are the facts, why, but you're open to appeal. And this is not an appeal that's secret. Like it's all public for everyone to see. It's very possible. And that's a way. This is a third component that would be running, that could be balance leadership, be balancing leadership, civilians as stakeholders, and the global model in terms of a background running software, sort of like an antivirus or like a maintenance like function. And yeah, that's how it can sort of be preserved and balanced. It does not have like the power to send an army. It's not going to give you aid. It's not going to take funding from anyone, not even gifts, but it brings some sort of due process and clarity, which also serves the status quo. And for instance, human trafficking, maybe it can't address right away, for instance, because the industry is too lucrative, and if not someone else might. But what it can do is it can soften it. So through softer means, it can try to make the process more humane, and then get to a point that those lobbies can be incentivized away from human trafficking towards other intangible industries that they can profit off of better, where they're also more legitimized, and disincentivized away from this when checks and balances are more in place and there's less of a need to do something like this. And you can sort of bring those requirements for which they have a market into more like streamlined ways, like adult consent, etc., etc., or like industries. You can clean things up a little bit in a way that human beings are more streamlined to be able to preemptively integrate, let's say, AI or digital intelligence or superior intelligence in a way that we've signaled better practical morality executed, so that in case of a better outcome, there's more of a chance that probabilities of such have increased, and that then getting to be coherent mutually with additional superintelligence is not chaotic, let's say, for the first 100 years, etc., even against humans. And that weapons, of course, they'll develop, innovation will develop, all of that stuff will be developing, but it won't be developing in chaos to the extent that something can get out of hand. And then if a bad outcome has to happen, it has to happen. But if a better outcome is possible, at least we know we hadn't condemned ourselves to worse outcomes by being more aggressive than we had to be, and going backwards versus taking learnings of the past where reforms had helped. So that mentality of, oh, the person who scams is the smartest, I don't buy that for 1 second. I think that's impractical and I think that's short-sighted. And yeah, that's just a little bit of a gist of the model. And then, for instance, now a second case study, only if this is organic, because if it's not organic, it'll fall apart, it won't work. In a healthier sort of functioning, in healthier sort of functioning, Europe can embed itself in, let's say, a renaissance of better values. And instead of the sort of identity politics of like, oh, religion, it's Jews, it's Muslims, it's Christians, it's seculars, it's atheists, it's Hindus. Instead of that kind of identity politics, it's like, no, how do we resolve our law and order in a sensible way that we're not alienating our minorities and some third party can't play a game with, etc. Into like, playing us into creating more confusion. Or, so for instance, wokeness. If you have a problem with wokeness, why do you exclude Zionist wokeness? So, that sort of consistency comes into play while diversity remains. And that's sort of like the preliminaries. And then I happened to look up later that even Einstein, for instance, had spoken of a global constitution, but there were some limitations because of which it wasn't possible. And this model actually happens to cover all limitations, and it's called universal sentience reform. Another advantage to this is that there's just one possibility that we can at least eradicate. I hope you can't hear this, but if you can, I'm sorry. This is spontaneous, so we have to like deal with it. So basically, I think I'll wait for this call to get done. So basically, there's a chance that the Drake equation shows that there's a likelihood of other life, other like in space, and there's that potential possibility that we're too regressive and evil and primitive instead of being mature when we have all the reasons to be mature, and being evil and primitive hurts our interests. It didn't even help our interests, as my case study September 22nd, 2023 on has shown, and November 2022 on has shown the example of Israel. how it hurt its own interests and the interests of the West when it was getting Greater Israel and an intelligent corridor. But it just, and it was getting strength against, and the West was too, against Russia, China, Iran, all of them. And Israel just messed it up and, hurt its own interests in the process. And the West is in the weakest position it's been in nearly a century now, including world wars. This is still the weakest position the West's been in globally. And so there's a chance that we can eliminate one more possibility, which is that we're too primitive and rudimentary to be worthy of contact because we haven't evolved into our tools and into the necessity of our sort of global model. And as a result, we're not deserving of contact. At least we'll have eliminated that as a possibility. So that's, I think, worth checking because we are a species that doesn't have to be primitive, but we act more primitive than we are to the detriment of our interests. And simultaneously AI integration and all human beings as stakeholders, and yet responsibility remaining, and yet diversity remaining, and yet other species and climate factors and considerations. These are all also better integrated. If you can hear that, I'm really sorry. But I'm sorry. This is the budget I have. And it's fine. I chose not to take funding and stuff. Like I chose that in the beginning because we didn't want this getting corrupted. And then yeah, and then there's the potential of a better outcome with artificial intelligence. And we've streamlined ourselves into it without having to signal to AI, like Israel claimed Gaza is in Israel September 22nd, 2023, but then kill the children. 25% of Israel's own population on geography alone, Israel tried to torture and kill, which if it had any rudimentary understanding of human nature, it would know by now that results in more reactions and a worse world even for you and the norms that you set against yourself and your people and your allies people. But yeah, uh, so signaling to AI, this is how you should treat weaker, whatever, and this is how irrational you need to be, or you can or should be. Whereas even animals don't do this. Even animals act rationally to some extent. Yes, they have reasons behind what they do, and yeah. So this incorporates all of these things, and I hope that covers enough of everything. Yeah, it would have reports on like climate and stuff like that too. And if you say it's not, reforms have happened in history. For instance, I'm stealing this from Zuck when he talked about Augustus. But like reforms have happened in history to better, and we can do better than that with the learning curves of those reforms, and their errors. And we can see in history where they went wrong. And I have explained elsewhere in my writings why morality practically matters, whether or not you believe in God. Secularly, like it also matters, and practically. What else? What else? I just want to make sure I have everything because I've been talking about this for ages, and I think we're done. No, there's more. Like you can go read it if you want more details. But yeah, it's several components. And if you actually read it, it makes more sense than you realize. And if they say it's difficult, well, so is COVID management, and you did that globally. And so is then making blunders and then losing your interests and then getting lesser returns through worse ways and just losing your position and your world getting worse. That's much harder than this. This makes more sense. And yeah, and if not this, eventually people get tired. And then Europe's own history and other places' own history have shown that there are revolutions. And those revolutions can be like cashed in on by other places and they can become that and they can lead to the same problem. So you might as well, while you're in a position of strength, secure your position of strength longest term. You stand to gain from this most. And what else? No, I think there's one more point, but I can't remember it. Uh, um, um, yeah. And then within the same model, yes, all places, this is not the point, but I should add this. All places would also have to answer to sentience for all other beings. So you can eat meat, but are you being more humane than less when you can about your human lives and then your animal lives too? Just more humane than not, you know? Or like in hunting, are you more humane than not in what you're doing? So that even evil evolves, let's say. This is not the first time in history it's happened. something like this has happened. Its absence is showing more errors and it's showing more damage being done even to perpetrators. And yeah, and yeah, that's it. There's one more point, but I've forgotten it. Anyway, I just thought I should have this up somewhere. Okay.